And now the second speaker is Professor Andrew Yeo, who is a very appropriate speaker to talk to us about U.S. perspective on Korean Peninsula, obstacles, challenges, and next steps. Professor Andrew Yeo is a senior fellow and a SK Korea Foundation chair in Korea Studies at Brookings Institute's Center for the East Asia Policy Studies. And he is a professor of politics at the Catholic University of America, where we are. 바로 이 대학의 교수님이십니다. 자, 앤드류 교수님 박수로 맞이하셔야겠습니다.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for that warm introduction. And I am at the Brookings Institution, but this is also my university, so I would like to welcome you here. I want to thank the USCCB and also the Korea Catholic Institute of Northeast Asia Peace for inviting me here. And it's a little strange looking out because usually I use this room to give exams. I used to give comprehensive exams to about 90 to 100 students, and now I'm looking at a group of people who are interested and care about North Korea. So it's definitely a change in an environment. And as an academic or a professor, I have done quite a bit of research on North Korea, not so much on the nuclear situation or on the security issues, but my research has mostly been about people-to-people exchanges or human rights. My last book was on marketization and state, society, and markets in North Korea. And so I'd much rather be giving the talk that Professor Kim just gave, because as an academic, that's more interesting. But I think I was invited here in part because of my new post at Brookings, where I think about these policy issues all the time. And as you've probably guessed, when you think about U.S. foreign policy, what's in the minds of U.S. policymakers is often what's in the news cycle. And so it's very strange to be asked, so tomorrow I'm going to be talking at Brookings. We have an internal retreat, and they asked me to talk at a breakout session where they have other challenges. So it's strange to see North Korea as an other issue when 3 or 4 years ago when we had these summit meetings between Kim Jong-un and President Trump and between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un, that was a major issue, but such is the nature of U.S. foreign policy. And so that does make addressing the North Korea issue a big challenge for the U.S. government. So I'm going to really just do make two broad points in my talk. And the first is really to really unpack the skepticism that exists among U.S. policymakers. I think you already know that the Biden administration is quite skeptical about North Korea. And then the second part of my talk, I want to just emphasize that we need some new kind of framework. I don't have the answer to what that new framework is, but maybe that's something that we can discuss in the breakout session. And actually, Frank my good friend Frank, we were in a meeting yesterday with a senior official from the National Intelligence Council, and I think the same themes kind of came up there, where we're really stuck, but we're also stuck in coming up with a new idea. So maybe that's one thing we can explore together as a group. So in terms of the skepticism in the U.S., I've just broken it down into four reasons. And this is skepticism after the Hanoi summit in 2019. And there was one other meeting, I think a lot of people don't remember, but after the Hanoi summit, the special representative to North Korea for the U.S., Steve Biegun, his team met the North Koreans in Stockholm, Sweden in October 2019. And they thought that maybe they could resume the dialogue from Hanoi. But I just remember that the meeting ended, people were angry. I think the US delegation left after 4 hours because it went nowhere. And there has been no high-level dialogue since that point. So the first reason is for the US skepticism is simply that North Korea has not responded at all to US overtures and requests for dialogue. I know that Mr. Scott Walker from the State Department was here yesterday, and he may have already told you this, but as you know, the U.S. has an offer to the North Koreans to meet them anytime, anywhere, with no preconditions. And I do think the U.S. is sincere about that, that they're willing to talk to the North Koreans, but the North Koreans have not responded. And it's not just about dialogue on the nuclear issue. Even discussions about humanitarian exchanges or about, there's ongoing issues about POW remains, American prisoner of war, and remains that are in North Korea. So there's no dialogue on that. In terms of COVID-19 vaccines, the U.S. government did offer, there was a plan to offer medical aid and assistance and even COVID-19 vaccines to North Korea, but North Koreans didn't want to accept those. And so from the U.S. position, they feel that, well, we've already reached out, the door is open, but North Korea is not coming. So that's one issue. The second issue, as you're well aware, is the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown, so the self-imposed lockdown that the North Koreans have put up themselves. And so the first 2 years of the pandemic, so 2020, 2021, the assumption was that no dialogue is going to happen until the pandemic ends. So we're waiting to ride out the pandemic. But I think things have eased. So North Korea went through, they had a spike in cases, they referred to them as fever cases because they don't have the equipment to actually test, sufficient equipment to test whether it's COVID. But they did have a spike in cases in May. But even as this pandemic lockdown continues, there's some that argue that Kim Jong-un regime is actually taking advantage of the pandemic lockdown, that he's centralized his authority. So Professor Kim Sung-kyung talked about the markets, and so markets were growing, and it's hard to say that they were flourishing, but certainly there were some changes that were made that allowed individual North Koreans to make money in markets. But at the 8th Party Congress, so earlier this year, Kim Jong-un talked about centralizing economic authority. So we see that the regime is trying to reassert authority over the economy, clamp down on markets, and there's also much tighter political control. So you've probably heard that human rights groups tries to bring in outside information into North Korea. Frank and I heard this yesterday about is Kim Jong-un more scared of the South Korean army or the BTS army? And it's hands down is the BTS army. But now there are these new laws that were passed that make it much stricter. The punishment is more severe if you're caught with outside information or Korean dramas or music. If you're caught watching those, the punishment is more strict. It's more severe. So some have argued that the pandemic lockdown is a good way for the regime to reset its authority. So again, that's a reason for skepticism of why North Korea is not coming out of its shell. The third reason is just looking at the missile tests. So last night, there was another missile test from North Korea. It's the 5th test in the last 9 days. It's the 23rd series of tests in 2022. North Korea is on a record pace for missile tests. And of course, there was the intermediate range missile that was fired over Japan. Japan was very upset about that. And so looking at North Korea's testing, from the vantage point of U.S. policymakers, clearly Kim Jong-un is trying to send a different message, and that's not one of dialogue. So that's the third reason for skepticism. And then the last reason is just global events, what I mentioned earlier, that the Ukraine issue is really the biggest focus of the Biden administration. That and then U.S.-China competition. Even at Brookings, and Brookings Institution has pretty close ties to the Biden administration just because many of our fellows went into the NSC and into the State Department. I just hear from them, it's really either about Russia or China. It's this return of great power politics. And North Korea really does not factor. I think the Biden administration just prays that they don't do a nuclear test or they don't do anything drastic to change the situation because Russia and China are really taking up much of the energies of the Biden administration. And just a side anecdote, I've taught a class at Catholic University called Asian Security since 2008, and there was 1 week where I talked about flashpoints in Asia. So it was Taiwan and North Korea, and In 2011, I stopped talking about Taiwan because I thought the issue was not, it was not as pertinent, and I just focused on North Korea. But I taught the class in the spring, and I reintroduced Taiwan again because that's what everyone is thinking about. And I've even heard policymakers. So, you probably know, the Koreans here know National Assemblyman Tae Young-ho. He was in the highest level North Korea defector since Hwang Chung-yap, and he was in DC, and I thought he wanted to talk to me about North Korean human rights, and he came to talk about Taiwan. He thinks the North Korea and Taiwan issue are linked, and I was wondering, does he want to link the issues because he thinks that that's going to get the attention of American policymakers because we care about Taiwan, and so bring in North Korea? I'm not suggesting that that's what his thinking was, but it was just interesting that even he wanted to talk about Taiwan, not North Korea. So a lot of skepticism within the Biden administration and within the US, and of course that makes it very difficult to have any kind of dialogue. So that gets to our point about needing a new framework. And so something that we discussed yesterday in our meeting with this senior official at the National Intelligence Council was that there's coming a point where at least the officials that deal with North Korea at the government level, they are, it's the same hands. They've been dealing with North Korea for the last 20 years, and there isn't really any new blood or younger people coming up that have experience dealing with North Koreans. And even in terms of contact, 10, 15 years ago, there was a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot, but there was at least some exchange at the people-to-people level, where whether it's humanitarian aid or development assistance, whether it was businesses or taekwondo groups of scientists working on forestry or agriculture, there was exchanges, and all of that has stopped for the last 4 or 5 years. And so our American knowledge of North Korea is really atrophying, meaning that there's no human contact, and so we're trying to understand North Korea without any direct interaction or engagement, and so that's really problematic. So in terms of, and I know I only have 3 minutes left, but in terms of thinking outside the box, so 2 things. One is on the nuclear front, and I know that this has been proposed a few times, and I know Frank has also talked about this as well, but there was a period, I think, during the Moon government where, at least in the US, there was some discussion about arms control. Now, what's the difference between arms control and denuclearization? Arms control was seen as a way of making an intermediate step towards denuclearization, because it's clear that North Korea does not want to give up its nuclear weapons. And so I felt that what North Korea wants is some kind of tacit some acknowledgement that North Korea is a nuclear state. Now, there's a lot of risks in saying that, well, we can concentrate on a freeze, arms control, but the point is to stabilize the situation. I think the US policy now, for lack of a better term, is again strategic patience, or I guess a longer way of saying is we're not sure what to do because nothing else works, but that's too long, so let's just call it strategic patience. But time is really on North Korea's side, because if you really do nothing, North Korea is just going to continue to test and continue to expand its nuclear capabilities. And I'm curious, because I know the USCCB and I know the Catholic Church has a position on nuclear weapons and on non-proliferation, but would it be acceptable for North Korea to be a nuclear state? So I was curious to hear, especially from the bishops, what reactions there are. Because from the peace perspective, the idea is if you want peace and engagement, it's better to at least have some kind of arms control agreement in place, and then to go from there and to normalize relations, or to begin to engage North Korea once again. But can you do that if, let's say North Korea ends up having good relations with the US, but they still end up having their nuclear weapons? And their country, I can give you examples, India, Israel. So what would the position of the church be? Because I think we're trying to move towards a nuclear-free society, and certainly that would not be the case. So that's the big dilemma. The second is on the engagement part, and this is you can talk about it at the government level, but also at the societal level. And I know the Korean president, President Yoon Suk-yeol, has laid out the audacious plan, which is really just lots of investment and aid for North Korea. But that also is going to go nowhere because that's not attractive to the North Koreans. They don't want South Korean money or investments. They want to be recognized as a nuclear state, and they talk about security guarantees. So there has to be something in addition to that, in addition to the investment and the aid. So it's the investment aid plus alpha, plus something else. So what is that plus? Is it, and I think I know what it is for North Koreans. They want things like stopping joint military exercises with the United States, or the removal of or reduction of U.S. troops. But these are going to be non-starters for the U.S. But in terms of engagement, and I'm going to steal from Frank because Frank had asked yesterday about, in terms of engagement, the U.S. policy has been to not issue any visa. There's a travel ban, or there's just a ban in general for U.S. citizens going to North Korea. And sorry to steal your point, Frank, but his idea was that it shouldn't be. It's one thing if North Koreans are preventing travel and engagement, but it shouldn't be coming from the U.S. side, that we shouldn't be banning the travel. And I know that there's reasons for it because there have been high-profile cases of Americans being detained, and so there are risks there. But do the benefits meaning that you'll still have, in a post-COVID period, maybe a few hundred Americans being able to go into North Korea doing humanitarian work or people-to-people engagement, who may follow the rules and maybe they'll be okay. Is that worth that's the benefit? Is it worth the risk of having someone, a U.S. citizen, detained? So again, we're really stuck on ideas, but we do know that the current frameworks, the current ideas out there have not worked. And so I think because of that, we haven't really decided to put forward anything. The Biden administration, the U.S., they're not putting any new ideas forward as well too. It's not for a lack of trying. I do think that the North Korea experts in the U.S. government they have tried to reach out at different moments in time, but we're just at a very difficult situation right now. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion section. Thank you.
Thank you.